Before battles were fought, before swords clashed and shields locked together, there was another war already underway. It was a quieter struggle, one fought not with courage or strategy but with bread and water, with animals and wagons, with roads and rivers. This was the hidden war of logistics, the unglamorous but essential lifeblood of every ancient campaign. Armies did not march on bravery alone. They marched on grain carried in sacks, water drawn from wells, fodder gathered for beasts, and supplies hauled across mountains and deserts. In the stories we remember, generals and kings stand tall: Alexander at the Granicus, Caesar at Alesia, Hannibal at Cannae. Yet behind them stretched columns of laborious craftsmen, animals, sailors, and servants, all ensuring that food reached the soldiers' bowls, that weapons remained sharp, that water flowed where thirst might otherwise have crushed hope. These were the silent companions of history, rarely named but always present, shaping victory and defeat alike. In this long journey, we will walk the forgotten roads of logistics. We will follow the Nile barges of Egypt and the canal barges of Mesopotamia. We will see the hoplites of Greece marching with their barley bread, the disciplined legions of Rome grinding their daily wheat, the caravans of Persia moving along the royal road, the elephants of India demanding endless fodder, and the armies of China fed by vast state granaries and canals. We will listen to the sounds of animals trudging, wagons creaking, forges hissing, and rivers carrying barges heavy with supplies. This is not a tale of glorious charges or decisive duels. It is a tale of endurance, of the hidden machinery that made glory possible. For while battles could be won in a day, wars were won by the patient rhythm of logistics, by the unbroken chain of sustenance that carried soldiers forward across months and years. So, sit back and let the centuries unfold. We will wander through the quiet heart of war, where courage was nothing without bread, and where victory was born not only in the clash of arms but in the steady hum of supply. Part 1. The hidden army behind the army. When people think about war in the ancient world, their imaginations tend to fill with the clamor of battle. They picture bronze shields clashing in the Greek phalanx, Roman legions advancing in disciplined lines, or Persian cavalry charging across the plains. Yet, beneath the noise of steel and the spectacle of heroism lay a quieter truth, one rarely celebrated in poems or carved into stone reliefs. Armies were more than soldiers. They were vast, moving organisms, and their lifeblood was not courage but supplies. Behind every shining spear and sharpened sword stood an invisible army of planners, carriers, builders, and laborious. Without them, the most brilliant general was powerless, his soldiers weakened before they even glimpsed their enemy. This hidden army was logistics, and it ruled every campaign, whether kings admitted it or not. To understand how wars were fought in the ancient world, one must first understand how armies were fed and moved. A soldier could not march without bread in his belly, nor could a horse charge without fodder. An army might number 50,000 men, but each one of those men consumed food every single day. Multiply one soldier's ration by thousands, and soon the appetite of the army became monstrous. Every sunrise demanded new supplies. Grain had to be ground, fires had to be lit, pots had to bubble with porridge or stews, and wagons had to creak forward with heavy sacks of provisions. If even a single link in this chain faltered, the entire force suffered. Hunger spread quickly, morale broke, and desertion followed. Armies that ran out of food ceased to be armies. They became desperate mobs, wandering the land in search of sustenance, easy prey for disciplined opponents. Generals who appear in our histories as masters of strategy were, in truth, first masters of logistics. Alexander of Macedon may have been bold in battle, but he also relied on an army of administrators who built supply depots along his route into Asia. Julius Caesar dazzled with speeches and swift victories, Yet much of his success came from ensuring a steady flow of grain to his soldiers in Gaul. Even centuries earlier, kings of Mesopotamia stocked temple storehouses not merely for religion but as secure reserves for armies. It is tempting to imagine war as a contest of bravery and clever tactics, but victory often belonged to the side that marched with full stomachs and strong feet rather than the one with sharper swords. The battlefield was only the final act. The long preparation of supplies and transport decided much before a single weapon was lifted. Distance was the greatest enemy of logistics. The further an army marched, the more tenuous its lifeline became. Every additional mile stretched the chain of wagons, boats, and beasts of burden required to keep the army alive. If supplies came by wagon, the animals pulling them also needed food, which meant part of the cargo was consumed before it reached the soldiers. Ships could carry far more than wagons, but they required rivers or seas, and not every theatre of war allowed such luxury. Pack animals like donkeys, camels, and mules were versatile, yet they tired and died if pushed beyond their limits. Commanders who ignored these limits discovered too late that their forces arrived at battle not as an army but as a starved remnant. Ancient texts speak of defeats with drama, but often what truly destroyed armies was the silent grinding down of logistics, the slow erosion of strength along dusty roads or barren deserts. What made logistics so invisible in ancient accounts was that it did not glitter. Chroniclers preferred to describe the heroism of a warrior or the speeches of kings. Yet behind the front ranks of fighters stretched long trains of wagons and countless workers. There were cooks who stirred enormous pots of grain into porridge. There were blacksmiths who hammered dents from shields and reshaped broken spearheads. There were carpenters who repaired wagons and built makeshift bridges. There were leatherworkers who mended sandals and straps. Water carriers walked in endless lines, filling skins at rivers and lakes. Families often followed as well, wives and children trudging along to cook and wash for the men. These people rarely appear in history, but they made campaigns possible. Without their labor, soldiers would have no shoes, no firewood, and no meals at the end of the march. Think of a Roman legion, often numbering 5,000 men. It was not simply a fighting unit, but a mobile city. Alongside the legionnaires came herds of animals for food, wagons stacked with tents, tools for digging, and sacks of grain. Firewood was collected to cook meals and warm the men at night. Engineers traveled with them, able to throw up a fortified camp each evening. The legion could not survive without its hidden workers. When the army moved, it was as though an entire settlement was lifted from the ground and carried forward on the backs of men and beasts. Dust rose in clouds as endless feet tramped in rhythm, the metallic rattle of equipment mixing with the lowing of oxen and the creak of wooden wheels. This was not a heroic scene in the traditional sense, but it was the daily reality of war. Even smaller armies required astonishing amounts of planning. A Greek hoplite force might march for days to meet its enemy, and each man carried rations on his back. Yet those rations could not last forever. If reinforcements of supplies did not follow, hunger would gnaw at the men before battle. Naval expeditions demanded still more attention. A trireme needed not only rowers and marines but also grain and water, stored carefully in cramped holds. When fleets sailed, they relied on coastal supply stations, without which the oars would soon fall silent. War at sea was no freer of logistics than war on land. It is easy to assume that ancient armies lived off the land, plundering farms as they passed. In truth, this was unreliable. Land could be barren, already stripped by previous armies, or deliberately destroyed by defenders. Fields could be burned, wells poisoned, and granaries emptied in advance of an invader's arrival. If a commander relied solely on foraging, his men might find themselves with empty hands in hostile territory. This is why wise leaders carried provisions with them, building depots behind their lines and arranging transport from friendly lands. Logistics was as much about foresight as it was about movement. A plan that ignored food and water was not a plan at all. The hidden army of logistics also shaped morale. A soldier who went to sleep with a full stomach, warm by a fire, and dry beneath a tent awoke with strength and confidence. A soldier who lay hungry and wet was beaten before the battle began. Animals mattered just as much. Horses and oxen that received fodder carried wagons further, pulled siege engines faster, and charged into battle with vigor. Deprived of food, they collapsed, and with them collapsed the machinery of war. Supply lines were not merely about survival, they were about maintaining the spirit of the army, the vital belief that they were cared for and prepared. Victory, then, often rested not with those who fought hardest but with those who planned best. The Persians built their royal road to move supplies swiftly across their empire. The Romans laid their network of highways so legions could march with steady resupply. The Chinese constructed granaries along frontier walls to feed soldiers stationed against nomadic incursions. All of these achievements were not glorious in the traditional sense, but they were decisive. They turned armies into enduring instruments of power, able to move and fight far from home. They gave empires the reach to conquer and the endurance to hold. Yet for every example of success, there were countless stories of failure. Armies starved in deserts, froze in mountains, or drowned in rivers when their supplies faltered. Many campaigns ended not in the clash of steel but in the quiet crumble of men too weak to fight. Chroniclers sometimes masked these defeats in tales of betrayal or bad luck, but the truth was simpler. The army had outrun its supplies. The hidden army had been neglected, and the visible army had paid the price. War was always about food, water, clothing, and roads before it was about swords and spears. The more one studies ancient warfare, the clearer it becomes that logistics was the real general behind every campaign. The famed leaders understood this, even if later histories did not. They thought in terms of rations and fodder as much as strategy. They weighed not only the courage of their soldiers but also the strength of their supply lines. They moved cautiously when supplies were thin and boldly when depots were full. For them, logistics was not a dull detail but the heart of war itself. Without it, they would have been nothing more than dreamers leading hungry men into oblivion. In this way, the hidden army behind the army deserves recognition. It was made up of uncelebrated workers, countless animals, endless wagons, and the foresight of planners. It was the cooks stirring porridge at dawn, the carpenters repairing wagons at dusk, the water carriers trudging with skins slung across their shoulders. It was the oxen plodding forward, their hooves beating out the rhythm of supply. It was the ships laden with grain, their sails swelling with wind as they carried life to distant troops. Together, these formed an army of endurance, invisible yet indispensable. They did not win glory, but they won wars. As the story of war logistics unfolds, one realizes that behind every battlefield triumph lies a longer, quieter tale. It is the story of food gathered from distant fields, of wagons rattling across rough roads, of animals straining under heavy loads, of planners marking out depots along the way. This was the foundation upon which empires rose and fell. To ignore it is to misunderstand the true nature of power in the ancient world. War was never just the clash of heroes. It was, and always will be, the triumph or failure of supply. In the chapters that follow, we will walk deeper into this hidden world. We will trace how soldiers were fed, how roads and rivers carried supplies, how animals bore the burden of empire, how craftsmen kept armies equipped, and how great civilizations like Egypt, Greece, Rome, Persia, and China mastered the art of sustaining war. But before we turn to those details, it is enough to see this one truth clearly. the most important army in the ancient world was not the one holding swords, but the one carrying bread. Part 2. Feeding the legions. If war is often said to march on its stomach, then nowhere is this more evident than in the armies of the ancient world. For all the splendor of polished armor, gleaming shields, and banners snapping in the wind, an army was nothing if it could not eat. The glamour of conquest was built on the humble labor of gathering grain, slaughtering animals, and boiling pots of porridge. Food was the true fuel of empires, and the struggle to feed men in hostile lands was one of the greatest challenges faced by every commander. To speak of logistics is to speak first and foremost of feeding the legions, for hunger was as deadly an enemy as any spear or arrow. Imagine an army of 40,000 men setting out on campaign. Each man requires at least a kilogram of grain a day to remain strong enough to march and fight. That means 40,000 kilograms of food consumed every single sunrise, with no pause and no exceptions. Add to that the fodder for thousands of horses, mules, donkeys, and oxen, and the figures swell beyond comprehension. In only a week, the army would devour hundreds of thousands of kilograms of supplies. Grain could be dried and stored, but meat spoiled quickly, and fresh produce was a rare luxury. This meant that the vast majority of food an army consumed was grain, wheat, barley, oats, or millet, depending on the region. Bread and porridge were the staples of soldiers, the monotonous but dependable fare that kept their legs moving and their swords steady. The Romans understood this truth with unmatched clarity. Their legions were fed on carefully measured rations, distributed with military precision. A soldier's basic allowance might include wheat to be ground into flour, a little salt, sometimes bacon or cheese, and when fortune smiled, wine or vinegar mixed with water to make it safer to drink. The burden of cooking was placed on the soldiers themselves, who gathered in small groups to grind grain, knead dough, and bake rough loaves on the march. This ritual of feeding was as much a part of military life as drilling or marching. At dawn, the sound of grinding stones mixed with the crackle of fires, and the smell of bread rose from countless little hearths. It was not fine food, but it was enough. Other cultures followed similar patterns. Greek hoplites carried rations of barley meal, dried cheese, and onions, foods that could endure travel and be eaten with little preparation. Persians relied heavily on flatbreads, dried fruits, and wine, all portable and sustaining. In Egypt, armies marching along the Nile benefited from shipments of grain transported by boat, while soldiers ate bread baked in clay ovens at their camps. In China, millet and rice were the standard fare, boiled into gruels that could feed large numbers efficiently. Across cultures and centuries, the meals of soldiers had much in common: simple, filling, and reliable, but rarely varied or luxurious. The central challenge was not merely providing food but ensuring its steady flow. Armies on the march could not carry endless supplies with them. Wagons and animals had their limits, and as the days passed, the burden grew lighter not because the army had more room but because the food had been eaten. Commanders had to plan routes that passed through fertile regions, or ensure that supply convoys trailed the army from behind. Rome mastered this by building roads that allowed wagons to roll swiftly across provinces, delivering grain from depots. Persia relied on its royal road and a network of storehouses, enabling vast forces to be provisioned far from home. Where roads and rivers were lacking, armies often turned to the sea, for ships could carry far more food than wagons. Fleets shadowed armies along coasts, packed with amphorae of grain, oil, and wine. In many campaigns, control of the sea was less about naval battle and more about ensuring supplies could arrive safely. Yet, despite the best planning, shortages were common. An army might arrive at an empty landscape, its fields burned by defenders. Wells could be fouled, granaries emptied, orchards cut down. Commanders learned to fear scorched earth tactics, for an army cut off from food was doomed. Soldiers might begin slaughtering their pack animals, consuming the very beasts needed to haul weapons and supplies. Hunger gnawed at discipline, turning men restless and desperate. In extreme cases, entire armies dissolved, scattering in search of something to eat. Chroniclers sometimes painted such moments as divine punishment or cowardice, but the truth was simpler. No man can fight on an empty stomach. Because of this, armies often traveled with massive herds of animals for slaughter. Sheep, goats, and cattle marched with the men, slowing the column but ensuring fresh meat when needed. These animals consumed fodder of their own, further straining resources, but they provided a buffer against starvation. Sometimes families and camp followers brought chickens or goats, giving armies small reserves of food and milk. Still, grain remained supreme, for it packed the most energy into the smallest volume and lasted the longest. Grain was life, and wars were won or lost over its supply. The politics of food was no less important than the practicalities. In Rome, grain supply was a matter of state, managed by officials who ensured that armies received their rations. Entire provinces were dedicated to feeding the legions. Egypt, with its fertile Nile Valley, became Rome's breadbasket, shipping millions of bushels of grain across the Mediterranean. Control of grain routes was control of empire. When ships failed to arrive or supplies were interrupted, mutiny threatened. Soldiers who believed they were neglected by their commanders grew restless, for nothing undermined loyalty faster than hunger. Wise leaders ensured that their men ate before worrying about their own meals, knowing that an army well fed was an army well bound to its general. Feeding armies also shaped strategy. Campaigns were often planned around harvests. Armies might wait for crops to ripen, then march to seize them. Others moved swiftly to deny enemies their food before it could be gathered. Battles were sometimes fought not for cities or forts, but for granaries and fertile valleys. Grain was the true treasure of war, more valuable than gold or silver. Without it, men could not fight, no matter how rich their commander might be. The daily life of a soldier revolved around food as much as battle. Marching under the sun with heavy equipment, he longed for the evening when he could rest by the fire, chew bread, and sip watered wine. The taste was plain, sometimes bitter, but it brought comfort. Eating together bound men as comrades, creating small communities within the vast army. Around campfires, bread was broken, stories told, and strength renewed. These quiet meals, shared in dust and sweat, were the true heart of the army's endurance. There were, of course, moments of luxury. Victorious armies plundered enemy stores, feasting on wine, fruits, and delicacies. For a night, soldiers tasted abundance, only to return to their rations the next day. Such feasts were dangerous in their own way, for overindulgence weakened discipline. Commanders often struggled to keep their men from losing focus when they stumbled upon unexpected bounty. Food was always a double-edged sword. Too little sapped strength, too much threatened order. The shadow of hunger haunted every campaign. Stories abound of armies brought low not by the sword but by the slow death of starvation. Xerxes' vast army, which marched into Greece, suffered immense strain on its supplies, consuming entire regions as it passed. Alexander the Great, despite his brilliance, nearly lost his army in the Gedrosian desert when food ran out and men perished by the thousands. Even Rome, with its well-drilled supply system, faced disaster when grain failed to arrive in time. Hunger was relentless, impartial, and utterly destructive. No general could ignore it, for it was as much an enemy as any rival king. And yet, despite all its burdens, feeding the legions was a triumph of human organization. The ability to gather food from far-off provinces, to transport it across mountains, rivers, and seas, and to distribute it fairly among tens of thousands of men was an astonishing achievement. It required foresight, discipline, and constant labor. It turned war into more than a clash of arms. It made it a vast exercise in resource management. Behind every victory lay the unglamorous work of farmers, bakers, sailors, and mule drivers, who never saw the battlefield but whose efforts decided its outcome. When we strip away the romance of war and look at its foundation, we see clearly that armies marched not on courage but on bread. The daily grind of feeding soldiers was the quiet heartbeat of every campaign. A soldier might forget the speech of his general, but he never forgot the taste of his ration. A battle might last a day, but the struggle to feed the army lasted every hour, from the moment the sun rose until the last embers of the campfires faded. It was in this endless struggle that wars were truly won or lost. As we move deeper into the world of war logistics, the next layer unfolds naturally. If food was the lifeblood of armies, then the roads, rivers, and seas were the veins and arteries that carried it. Without transport, food rotted in depots, unreachable by the hungry men at the front. In the next part, we will follow the paths of supply, tracing the wagons that rolled across Roman roads, the boats that glided along the Nile, and the ships that shadowed armies along the coasts. We will see how geography shaped campaigns, and how the art of transport turned the simple act of eating into a grand enterprise of empire. Part 3: Roads, Rivers, and Seas. If food was the lifeblood of armies, then transport was the system of veins and arteries that kept that lifeblood moving. It is one thing to gather grain and fodder, but quite another to bring them to the mouths of hungry soldiers hundreds of miles away. In the ancient world, where speed was measured by the pace of animals and the pull of oars, moving supplies was an endless battle against distance and time. Roads, rivers, and seas were not just features of geography. They were the pathways of survival, and those who mastered them held the keys to victory. Imagine an army marching without the aid of roads. Every wagon will sink into mud, every step becomes a struggle through tangled undergrowth, every river crossing a dangerous obstacle. Supplies slow to a crawl, while men grow hungry and impatient. Armies may boast of their numbers, but without clear routes for transport, they stumble like blind giants. It was for this reason that some of the greatest achievements of ancient empires were not battles but roads. The Persians built their royal road, stretching for thousands of kilometers across their empire, lined with stations where horses could be changed and messengers refreshed. The Romans went further still, laying down stone upon stone to create a network of highways so strong that some survive even today. These were not luxuries but necessities, designed to move grain, troops, and information with unmatched speed. The Roman road in particular became the spine of empire. Soldiers marched upon its flat surfaces with ease, but so too did endless lines of carts carrying sacks of grain, barrels of wine, and crates of weapons. The roads linked provinces to Rome itself, ensuring that the capital could be fed and that armies stationed at the frontiers could be supplied from the heart of Italy or from the fertile provinces of Gaul and Spain. Along the way were way stations, inns, and depots, where caravans could rest and resupply. The rhythm of the road became the rhythm of empire, its steady beat carrying life into the most distant provinces. Without these arteries, Roman armies could not have fought year after year in foreign lands. Yet roads alone were not enough. Even the best highways could not match the capacity of water. A single ship could carry as much grain as hundreds of carts, and with far less effort. This was why rivers and seas were prized above all for transport. The Nile in Egypt was the most famous example. Each year its floods renewed the fields with rich silt, and its broad waters carried grain from villages to storehouses and then to the armies of the pharaohs. Boats laden with sacks of barley and wheat drifted down the current, pulled by the steady push of poles or the billow of sails. The Nile was a road that nature had built, and it sustained not only Egypt's armies but its entire civilization. Elsewhere, rivers played similar roles. In Mesopotamia, barges floated down the Tigris and Euphrates, stacked high with supplies. In China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze became great channels of movement, later linked by canals that bound the empire together. In Greece, rivers were fewer and shorter, but the sea offered endless pathways. The Aegean, dotted with islands and sheltered harbors, became a watery highway along which triremes and merchant ships carried soldiers and supplies. Armies marched more easily when their ships could shadow them, landing provisions at coastal points. In truth, many Greek campaigns were designed to hug the coastlines, for to move inland meant to risk hunger and the slow crawl of wagons over rocky ground. The Persians, with their vast empire stretching from the Aegean to India, relied on both road and sea. Their royal road allowed couriers to carry messages across thousands of kilometers in mere days, but their fleets carried supplies to distant armies with equal importance. Control of harbors and coastal routes meant control of provisions. When their fleets faltered, their armies inland began to weaken. For all the grandeur of the Persian kings, their power was tied to the movement of food and water across these arteries of empire. One must imagine the sights and sounds of such transport to appreciate its scale. Wagons creaking under the weight of sacks, oxen pulling with slow determination, muleteers shouting to their beasts, and behind them dust rising in endless clouds. On rivers, barges drifted silently, their hulls low in the water from the weight of grain, while men strained at poles to push them against the current. On the sea, ships groaned as ropes stretched taut, sails snapping in the wind as they bore amphorae of oil and wine across the waves. These movements were not glamorous, yet they were the pulse of war. Without them, no army would eat, no soldier would fight, and no empire would endure. Geography shaped every campaign because of transport. A commander had to ask not only where the enemy was, but also how to reach him without starving his men along the way. Mountains, deserts, and forests were not just obstacles of terrain, but obstacles of supply. Armies bogged down in mountains consumed their stores faster than new ones could arrive. Deserts offered no fodder for animals, no water for men, and required supply convoys so long that they broke under their own weight. Forests slowed wagons and forced armies to march light, risking hunger. For these reasons, the most successful campaigns were often those fought along rivers or coasts, where supplies could follow easily by water. The difference between success and failure often lay in control of these arteries. When Athens fought Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, it was not merely the clash of hoplites that mattered, but the ability of Athens to supply itself by sea. The Athenian fleet turned the Aegean into its lifeline, bringing grain from the Black Sea to feed the city. Without its ships, Athens would have starved long before its walls fell. Sparta, land-based and without a strong navy at first, learned that control of the sea was as crucial as control of the land. It was only when Sparta, with Persian help, built a fleet that it could choke Athens' lifeline and win the war. Rome too understood this. Its roads allowed legions to march quickly, but its fleets carried grain from Africa and Egypt. When those fleets were threatened by pirates or rival navies, Rome trembled. The grain supply to the city was so vital that fleets were given military escorts, and commanders were judged on their ability to keep the flow steady. A hungry Rome was a restless Rome, and unrest in the capital could topple leaders as surely as defeat in battle. Thus, to command the sea was not a matter of prestige but of survival. There is a quiet poetry in these movements of supplies. The soldier may have dreamed of glory, but the muleteer dreamed only of reaching the next station before his animals collapsed. The sailor rowed not for victory but to keep his cargo dry and afloat. The road builder laid stone upon stone not to hear cheers but to ensure that a cart rolled smoothly. And yet, all these labors came together to create the foundation upon which empires stood. Armies won battles, but transport won wars. As night fell on these endless journeys, fires flickered along riverbanks where barges tied up for rest, and wagons circled in meadows where animals grazed before sleeping. Men ate quickly, then lay down with the creak of wagons still echoing in their ears. In the morning, the march resumed, the road stretching ever onward, the river ever flowing, the sea ever restless. This was the rhythm of war, not the clash of steel but the steady beat of movement, day after day, mile after mile. It is tempting to think of these systems as fragile, yet they were resilient in their own way. The Roman roads endured centuries, their stones outlasting the empire itself. The Nile's waters never ceased to flow, bearing grain for countless generations. The Aegean remained dotted with sails, carrying soldiers and supplies long after Athens and Sparta were dust. These arteries were not just of war but of life, binding regions into civilizations. To master them was to hold power, to lose them was to crumble into weakness. And so, when we picture the armies of the ancient world, we must not only imagine the lines of soldiers but also the endless roads beneath their feet, the barges drifting along rivers, and the ships swelling with wind. These were the unseen forces that decided the fate of kings and empires. For while courage might decide a moment, it was transport that decided endurance. Without roads, rivers, and seas, the hidden army of logistics could not march, and without logistics, no army could fight. Part 4. The Animal Workforce. When we think of armies, we tend to imagine men in armor, shields raised, swords drawn, their voices lifted in cries of defiance or victory. Yet, in truth, half of every army was not made of men at all. It was made of animals. They carried the weight of war on their backs and shoulders, and without them, human strength alone would have crumbled beneath the burden. They were the silent companions of every campaign, trudging beside soldiers, straining at harnesses, or charging into battle with thunder in their steps. Horses, camels, donkeys, oxen, and even elephants formed the backbone of the ancient logistics machine. They did not write histories, but they made them possible. The horse above all came to symbolize war. Swift, powerful, and proud, it carried generals into battle and pulled the chariots of kings. But its most important role was not in combat but in transport. Horses hauled carts stacked with supplies, bore riders who carried urgent messages, and gave armies the mobility to strike quickly across vast distances. The upkeep of a single horse was a burden. It required grain, water, and careful care, far more than a man. Multiply that by thousands, and one sees how much strain an army's herd placed on its supplies. Yet no general could dispense with them, for without horses, an army was bound to the slow pace of human legs. Horses gave wings to war, and so empires spent fortunes on breeding, training, and feeding them. Donkeys and mules, humbler than horses, were perhaps more important still. They carried loads that would have broken men's backs, sacks of grain, bundles of firewood, tools of iron, and water skins heavy with life. They were steady creatures, slower than horses but enduring in their patience. A donkey could pick its way along mountain paths where wagons could not pass, and it required less food than a horse. Mules, bred for strength and toughness, became prized companions of legions and caravans alike. Their braying was the music of the march, their hoofbeats the steady drumbeat of supply. While heroes rode horses into battle, it was the donkey and the mule who kept the soldiers fed behind the lines. Oxen too played their part, though they moved with greater heaviness. Yoked in pairs, they dragged wagons over roads, their vast bodies swaying with every step. Slow but steady, they could haul loads far greater than horses or donkeys. They required fodder and rest, but they gave back endurance, pulling supply trains that stretched for miles. An army might march ahead swiftly, but its oxen determined the pace of its wagons, and thus the rhythm of its supplies. If oxen collapsed from exhaustion, the wagons stopped, and the army starved. Their bellowing cries echoed across ancient fields, a reminder that even the mightiest soldier relied on the quiet toil of beasts. Camels, by contrast, were creatures of the desert, perfectly suited to lands where other animals perished. Their ability to travel days without water, to carry heavy loads, and to thrive on sparse fodder made them indispensable in arid campaigns. Persian armies used camels not only for carrying supplies but also for unnerving enemy horses with their strange smell. In Arabia and North Africa, camels allowed armies to cross barren wastes where men alone would have withered. They became living ships of the desert, their humps rising like sails, their slow, swaying gait carrying food and water across endless dunes. Where the land offered nothing, the camel ensured survival. And then there were the elephants, the giants of war. Their presence was less common, but when they appeared, they left unforgettable marks on history. In India, they had long been used in battle, carrying towers on their backs from which archers and javelin throwers rained death upon the enemy. When brought westward, they astonished and terrified. The Carthaginian general Hannibal famously led elephants across the Alps to strike at Rome, though many of the beasts perished in the cold. Elephants could pull immense loads, crash through enemy lines, and carry soldiers into battle like living fortresses. Yet they were difficult to feed and maintain, their appetites vast, their tempers dangerous. Only the wealthiest kings could afford to keep them in their armies for long. They were symbols of power as much as tools of war, and when they appeared on the battlefield, their sheer size often unnerved opponents before a single blow was struck. All of these animals were not merely tools, they were living beings with needs that had to be met. An army that marched with thousands of animals had to provide water, fodder, and rest for them as carefully as for the soldiers. A horse denied grain would weaken, a camel denied water would falter, an ox driven too hard would collapse in its yoke. Caring for these creatures demanded countless laborious grooms to brush coats and tend hooves, drivers to guide carts and loads, herdsmen to move animals to pasture. The hidden workforce of war included not only human servants but entire herds of animals, each with their own silent demands. The impact of animals on strategy was immense. A general had to consider how much fodder could be carried, how far horses could ride before they tired, how many rivers wagons could cross before oxen drowned in their harnesses. Campaigns were shaped not by maps of cities alone but by grazing lands, watering holes, and the capacity of animals to endure the march. In deserts, the presence of camels could determine whether an army survived. In mountains, the strength of mules made the difference between success and disaster. Even in fertile lands, commanders had to guard their animals from disease and exhaustion, for without them the supply chain broke. The sounds of these beasts mingled with the human chorus of armies. Horses snorted and stamped at dawn as soldiers saddled them for the day's ride. Donkeys brayed endlessly, their cries carrying across valleys, while mules trudged in silence, ears flicking at every insect. Oxen lowed in deep tones as they strained at wagons, their hooves dragging through mud. Camels groaned and hissed, their long necks swaying above the ranks of men. Elephants trumpeted, their calls reverberating like thunder through forests or plains. To hear an army on the march was not merely to hear human voices but the chorus of an entire menagerie, each part of the symphony of war. There was also the bond between man and beast, forged in hardship. A soldier who marched beside his mule came to know its quirks, its stubbornness, its moments of surprising patience. A rider trusted his horse with his life, feeding it scraps of his own rations when fodder ran low. Camel drivers spoke to their animals in soft tones, guiding them through blistering heat. Even elephants, massive and unpredictable, formed bonds with their mahouts, the men who rode upon their necks and steered them with words and touch. These bonds mattered, for an army was not only a collection of men but a partnership between man and animal, each relying on the other to survive. The cost of losing animals could be catastrophic. If disease swept through the herds, wagons halted, cavalry lost their mounts, and supplies rotted where they stood. Rivers that drowned oxen left armies stranded. Freezing cold that killed horses left generals immobile. In Hannibal's campaign, the loss of elephants to the alpine snows reduced his awe-inspiring beasts to a handful. In desert campaigns, camels that died from overwork could doom entire columns. Animals were soldiers too, though without voices, and when they fell, armies felt their absence keenly. Feeding these beasts was itself a logistical nightmare. Horses required not only grass but grain, carried in sacks that added to the burden of wagons. Oxen needed grazing time, slowing the pace of marches. Camels could endure long stretches without water, but when they drank, they consumed enormous amounts. Elephants demanded vast quantities of fodder daily, straining resources to their limit. Thus, armies were not merely feeding men but entire ecosystems of animals, each with unique needs. Commanders had to calculate not just rations for soldiers but for thousands of creatures, all hungry, all thirsty, all essential. And yet, for all this, animals gave armies their reach. With horses, an army could move swiftly, striking where it was least expected. With donkeys and mules, it could carry grain across rugged hills. With oxen, it could drag siege engines to the walls of cities. With camels, it could cross deserts where no one thought survival possible. With elephants, it could inspire terror before the first clash of arms. They expanded the horizon of war, turning what might have been impossible into the possible. They were not mere companions, they were partners in conquest. As night descended on the camps of armies, animals lay beside men, resting from the day's toil. Fires flickered, soldiers murmured, and the sounds of beasts filled the air: the snort of a horse, the low of an ox, the bray of a donkey, the groan of a camel. They were not celebrated in epics, nor carved into the monuments of kings, but they were there, always there, carrying the burdens that men could not. In their silence, they bore the true weight of war. Part 5. Water and Wine. Food sustained the body, but without water, armies could not take a single step. It was the simplest of needs and the most unforgiving. A soldier could survive days without grain, though his strength would fade. But deny him water in the heat of a march, and his lips cracked, his body weakened, and within hours he could collapse upon the ground. For every commander in the ancient world, water was a constant worry, as present in their thoughts as the enemy itself. It was not merely a matter of quenching thirst, but of sustaining entire moving cities of men and animals who consumed it in unthinkable amounts. A single man might drink 2 to 3 liters in a day of marching under the sun. Horses and oxen required many times that. When armies numbered in the tens of thousands, the thirst of man and beast created a demand that could drain rivers, empty wells, and dry lakes. For this reason, campaigns were shaped by water. Routes were chosen not only for their speed but for their springs and rivers. Armies often moved from well to well, from riverbank to riverbank, their pace dictated not by strategy but by thirst. Rivers were blessings, offering steady flows for drinking, cooking, and washing, but they could also betray armies, swelling with floods or guarded by enemies who knew that to deny water was to deny life. Wells in deserts became more valuable than fortresses, and commanders stationed men to guard them as fiercely as they would guard a city gate. A march through barren land was a gamble with death, for if scouts failed to find water, entire columns could vanish into the sands. The ancients devised countless ways to secure and carry water. Soldiers filled skins made of leather, gourds, and clay jars, carrying them upon their backs or loaded upon mules. Caravans of water-bearers trailed behind armies, their burdens sloshing with each step. Where rivers allowed, barges were loaded with barrels, drifting alongside marching columns to keep them supplied. In some places, aqueducts or canals brought water from distant springs, allowing garrisons to endure sieges that would otherwise have starved them of drink. In arid lands, armies often marched at night to conserve what little water they had, resting during the day to spare their bodies the searing sun. Thirst shaped every decision. Yet it was not only water that filled the skins of soldiers. Wine and beer, diluted with water, became staples in many armies. They were not luxuries but necessities, for alcohol purified unsafe water and provided calories and comfort. The Roman legionnaire was often given his ration of wine, mixed with water to prevent drunkenness but enough to lift spirits. Greeks carried wine as well, their amphorae clinking upon ships and wagons, poured out to celebrate victories or dull the weariness of marching. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, beer was more common, brewed thick and nourishing, consumed daily as part of the ration. Soldiers drank it not for revelry but for survival, its fermentation making it safer than stagnant water and its grain content filling bellies with extra energy. The flavor of these drinks became part of the rhythm of military life. A sip of watered wine after a long march, a gulp of beer in the evening by the fire, a swallow of cool river water at dawn, these small acts brought strength and comfort. For many soldiers, such moments were the only reprieve from hardship, their weary minds refreshed by the taste of drink. To deny a soldier his ration was to risk mutiny, for thirst bred anger faster than hunger. Commanders knew this, and they guarded their supplies of wine and beer as carefully as they guarded their stores of grain. Animals too demanded water, in quantities that dwarfed those of men. A horse could consume 30 liters in a day. An ox might drink even more. Camels could endure days without water, but when they drank, they emptied entire wells in gulps that left nothing for others. Elephants required torrents, whole rivers to slake their massive thirsts. To provide for these creatures was as critical as providing for the soldiers, for without them, wagons did not roll, cavalry did not charge, and armies did not move. The logistics of water was thus a dual burden. Men needed enough to fight, and beasts needed enough to carry the fight forward. The struggles for water were often desperate. Chronicles tell of armies collapsing in deserts, their ranks scattered as men searched in vain for hidden springs. Some clawed at the earth with their bare hands, hoping to find moisture beneath the surface. Others drank foul water from swamps, paying with sickness that spread through the camp. In sieges, defenders often tried to cut off an enemy's water, filling wells with sand or poisoning them with carrion. To capture a city's aqueducts was to choke it slowly, forcing surrender without a single blow. To protect their water, cities built cisterns beneath the earth, vast chambers where rain was stored, ready to outlast the longest siege. Thirst was as much a weapon as the sword, and generals wielded it with ruthless intent. Consider Alexander the Great's march across the Gedrosian desert. His men, scorched by the sun, suffered more from thirst than from enemy blades. Water skins ran dry, wells yielded nothing, and many soldiers perished upon the sand. In one tale, scouts found a small flask of water and brought it to Alexander. He looked at the precious drops, then poured them upon the ground before his men, saying that he would not drink while his soldiers suffered. The act inspired them to press on, but it did not ease their thirst. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, died, not from wounds but from the absence of water. This story is but one of many where thirst carved its mark upon history. Wine and beer softened these hardships, but they brought their own challenges. Amphorae of wine were heavy and fragile, prone to breaking on rough marches. Beer soured quickly, making it ill-suited for long journeys. Still, armies carried them, for morale depended upon them. The clink of amphorae in a wagon was as vital as the rattle of weapons, a reminder that the army marched not only with discipline but with comfort close at hand. The sharing of wine around a fire bound comrades together, easing the loneliness of distant campaigns. Beer, thick and filling, soothed hunger as much as thirst. These drinks were more than provisions. They were traditions, rituals that made soldiers feel human even in the inhuman world of war. The daily routines of drinking were woven into the rhythm of camp life. At dawn, soldiers filled their skins at rivers or wells, knowing the day's march would parch them quickly. At midday, they paused to drink in the shade, their lips cracked, their throats dry. At evening, when fires flickered, they drank again, raising cups to their comrades, murmuring to the gods, and savoring the relief of wetness in their mouths. These moments, small and fleeting, were the foundation of endurance. Without them, spirits withered. An army without water was no army at all, just a throng of desperate men stumbling toward death. Commanders learned to mark the land by its waters. Scouts were sent ahead not merely to find the enemy but to locate streams, wells, and springs. Maps were drawn not with borders but with rivers. The Nile, the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Indus, the Yellow River. These were not only the cradles of civilizations but the lifelines of their armies. The sea too offered salvation, its vastness carrying ships filled with barrels of fresh water drawn from rivers or springs. Coastal campaigns were safer because of this, for ships could bring water as well as food. Inland campaigns were always riskier, for there, the army lived at the mercy of wells and streams. Even the taste of water mattered. Soldiers grew weary of brackish or muddy water, longing for the cool sweetness of a spring. Wine and vinegar masked the taste of foul water, making it drinkable when otherwise it might have been spat out. This was why vinegar mixed with water, called posca by the Romans, became a standard ration. It was not elegant, but it killed bacteria, improved flavor, and kept men alive. Such simple mixtures saved more soldiers than many swords, their value lying in their power to sustain the body quietly, day after day. In the stillness of night, when soldiers lay upon the ground and animals rested nearby, the soft trickle of water from a stream or the hollow echo of a well being drawn brought comfort deeper than words. Men knew that as long as water flowed, they could endure another day. They could march again, fight again, and perhaps return home again. Deny them this sound, and the camp grew restless, fearful, and broken. The promise of water was the promise of life itself. Thus, water and wine together shaped the story of war. One was necessity, the other comfort. One quenched thirst, the other lifted spirit. Together they kept men alive and willing to march. They were carried in skins, jars, barrels, and amphorae, borne upon backs and beasts, guarded as treasures greater than gold. No empire could march without them, and no general could ignore them. Behind every victory stood rivers, wells, and cisterns, the silent allies of war. Part 6. Armories and Forges. An army could march on bread and water, it could follow roads and rivers, it could ride horses and drive oxen, but without weapons it was no army at all. The sword, the spear, the shield, and the bow were its voice and its strength. Yet weapons do not last forever. Blades dull, spear tips bend, armor dents, and bows splinter. Each clash of battle left behind not only the wounded and the dead but piles of broken equipment. For this reason, armies carried with them their own hidden workshops, armories, and forges. Behind the line of soldiers there was always the crack of hammers, the hiss of bellows, the glow of fires, and the steady work of craftsmen who gave armies their edge. The blacksmith was as important to an army as the general. He was not celebrated in poems or carved into stone, but his hands shaped victory. With hammer and anvil, he repaired what battle had broken. Bent spearheads were reheated and straightened, swords chipped in combat were ground back to sharpness, helmets battered by stones were beaten into shape again. Every evening, as soldiers rested by fires, the smiths lit their own, feeding them with charcoal and fanning them with bellows until the glow of metal lit the dark. The sound of hammers on iron carried through the night, a steady reminder that the army's weapons were being reborn for the next day's fight. Armorers worked alongside them, crafting and repairing shields, cuirasses, and helmets. A shield split by an enemy's blade was not discarded if it could be bound back together with leather and metal. Armor dented by arrows was hammered smooth, leather straps were replaced, buckles refitted. Soldiers knew that their safety lay not only in their courage but in the quiet hands of these men who labored behind the scenes. Every campaign became a cycle of destruction and repair, as the violence of the day was mended by the skill of the night. Carpenters, too, were vital. Wagons broke constantly on rough roads, wheels splintered, axles snapped, and carts collapsed under their loads. Without wagons, supplies rotted where they were stored, and armies starved. Carpenters patched planks, shaped new wheels, and bound axles with iron bands to make them last. They also built siege towers, ladders, and bridges when battles called for them. With saw and hammer, they turned raw wood into the structures of war. In many ways, their craft was as destructive as it was creative, for each tower they built was designed to fall upon an enemy's wall, and each ladder to carry men into the storm of battle. The forge itself was the heart of this hidden army. Its fires were fed with charcoal, its bellows pumped by strong arms, its anvils ringing with each strike. The smell of hot iron mingled with the dust and sweat of the camp. Soldiers came to the smiths with broken blades and dented helmets, waiting anxiously for them to be restored. A sword handed back, gleaming with a new edge, was more than a tool, it was hope returned. In the glow of the forge, war found its rhythm not in shouts but in the steady beat of iron shaped and reshaped. These craftsmen were not always soldiers, though some bore arms when needed. Many were specialists recruited for their skills, following armies in return for pay, protection, or plunder. Some were slaves, compelled to labor for their masters, their sweat fueling the war of others. Regardless of their station, their work was indispensable. Without them, weapons would dull, wagons collapse, armor fall apart, and armies crumble. They were the quiet industry of war, the invisible workshops that turned chaos into endurance. Consider the Roman legion. Each legion carried with it a complement of smiths and carpenters, enough to maintain the thousands of weapons and pieces of equipment that filled its ranks. Roman discipline extended even into logistics, with tools, nails, and spare parts carried in careful order. If a wagon broke, it was repaired swiftly. If a spear splintered, it was replaced. If armor cracked, it was reforged. This constant cycle of maintenance allowed Roman armies to fight campaign after campaign without collapsing under the weight of wear. It was not only their tactics that gave them power, but their attention to the unglamorous details of keeping every weapon ready for use. The Greeks too valued craftsmen, though their hoplite armies relied heavily on the support of their city-states. Armies raised for short campaigns could depend on home workshops to provide weapons, but in longer wars, smiths traveled with the men, patching shields and reworking spears. Carthage, famed for its fleets, depended on shipwrights who repaired hulls, replaced sails, and kept the lifeblood of the city moving across the Mediterranean. In Persia, entire workshops were established along the royal road, ensuring that supplies of weapons and tools could flow with the armies. In China, Dynasties supported vast armories, where weapons were manufactured in bulk and distributed along frontier garrisons. Sieges revealed the importance of these craftsmen most clearly. To besiege a city was to engage in a battle of tools as much as of men. Siege engines, catapults, ballistae, battering rams, and towers had to be built on the spot, assembled from wood and iron by the skilled hands of carpenters and smiths. Each piece required days of labor, and each engine demanded maintenance as it hurled stones or crashed against gates. Without craftsmen, an army could only stand before the walls and starve. With them, it could break down the barriers of stone and enter in triumph. The forge and the workshop were as important to siege as the courage of the soldiers scaling ladders. The daily life of a craftsman in the army was relentless. While soldiers rested from marching, the smiths worked. Their fires glowed late into the night, their hammers never still. They received no glory in victory and no songs were sung of their labor, yet every soldier knew their worth. A broken sword returned whole, a shield repaired, a wagon patched. These were small miracles repeated endlessly. The craftsmen did not march in formation, but their rhythm of labor was as disciplined as any legion. War also consumed tools at a terrifying rate. Nails, bolts, hinges, ropes, leather bindings, these vanished quickly, requiring constant replacement. Armies carried stores of raw materials, but often they had to scavenge from the land, stripping wood from forests, leather from cattle, iron from defeated enemies. The craftsmen turned whatever they could find into what the army needed. In their resourcefulness lay the survival of campaigns. A broken wagon might be replaced with timber from a nearby grove, a cracked sword reforged with iron taken from a village smithy. War was always hungry for materials, and the craftsmen fed it constantly. The image of war, then, is incomplete without the forge. Soldiers may be remembered for their bravery, but it was the blacksmith's hammer that gave their swords their edge. It was the carpenter's saw that gave their wagons their wheels. It was the armorer's patience that gave their shields their strength. In every campaign, the unseen chorus of tools at work was as vital as the clash of steel in battle. The army did not march alone. It marched with its forges, its workshops, its endless supply of hammers and saws, chisels and nails. When night settled upon the camp and the fires of soldiers began to dim, the forge still burned. Sparks rose into the dark, a silent constellation above the anvil. The craftsmen labored on, their sweat glistening in the glow, shaping iron and wood into the instruments of war. Soldiers fell asleep to the rhythm of hammer on metal, comforted by the knowledge that their weapons would be ready with the dawn. This was the true music of war, not the blare of trumpets or the roar of battle, but the quiet, steady beat of men at work, keeping the army alive one repair at a time. Part 7. Siege Machines and Engineers. War in the open field tested the strength of men and animals, but when armies turned their attention to cities, the struggle became one of ingenuity and endurance. Stone walls rose high above the ground, gates were barred with iron, and defenders rained down missiles upon those who dared approach. To overcome such barriers required more than courage. It required machines, crafted from wood, rope, and iron, designed to batter, climb, or hurl destruction. Behind every siege stood not only soldiers but an entire workforce of engineers, carpenters, and laborers who turned raw materials into engines of war. These men were as vital as the warriors themselves, for without their machines, armies would stand helpless before the walls of their enemies. Siege was the slowest and most grueling form of war. Armies that could not storm a city outright had to surround it, cutting off supplies and waiting for hunger to do their work. Yet hunger alone might take months or years to break a city, and many commanders lacked the time or patience. For this reason, they brought with them the knowledge of machines, towers that rose to meet the walls, battering rams that shook gates with every blow, catapults that hurled stones and fire into the heart of the city. To build these machines in the field required immense organization. Timber had to be cut, ropes twisted, iron-shaped, wheels fashioned. The army became a vast workshop, its fires and hammers working day and night. Consider the siege tower, a wooden colossus built to rival the height of city walls. Rising on wheels, it was pushed forward slowly, groaning under its own weight. Inside, soldiers climbed ladders, waiting to pour out upon the battlements once the tower touched stone. Its sides were covered with hides soaked in water to resist fire, its interior braced with beams to withstand stones hurled from above. Constructing such a tower demanded carpenters who could measure and cut with precision, and laborers who could lift and bind the immense timbers together. Soldiers might fight at the walls, but the tower was a battle all its own, fought with saws, hammers, and ropes before it ever rolled forward. The battering ram was another marvel of persistence. A great log, its tip capped with iron, suspended by chains within a wooden frame, it was swung back and forth by teams of men. With each crash, the gates of the city shuddered. The rhythm of its blows became the heartbeat of the siege, echoing across the walls, a constant reminder to the defenders that their barrier would not last forever. To protect the ram, the frame was often covered, creating a moving shelter called a tortoise, its roof layered with hides and planks to shield the men inside from arrows and fire. Building and maintaining these structures required engineers who understood balance, strength, and protection. They were as much soldiers as those who held swords, though their weapons were logs and levers. Catapults and ballistae brought destruction from afar. Powered by twisted ropes of sinew, they hurled stones, spears, and bolts across the walls, smashing defenses and scattering defenders. To craft such machines demanded great skill, for the ropes had to be twisted to the right tension, the arms shaped to withstand the force, the frames balanced to aim true. Engineers guarded their secrets carefully, for a well-built catapult could change the course of a siege. The thud of its release, the hiss of a stone through the air, the crash upon stone or flesh, these sounds filled the air around cities under siege. Defenders cowered behind shields, watching as their towers splintered and their walls cracked. Behind those shots stood teams of craftsmen adjusting ropes, oiling joints, and repairing splintered wood. Not all machines were so grand. Ladders, simple in design, demanded steady hands to build and brave souls to carry. Fascines, bundles of sticks thrown into moats, were tied by laborers who gathered brush from nearby fields. Mining too was a form of engineering, as men dug tunnels beneath walls, propping them with timber and then setting fire to collapse the earth. These hidden struggles beneath the ground were as dangerous as the fighting above, for tunnels might collapse, burying men in darkness. Every part of siege was labor, sweat, and patience. It was not only a clash of armies but a clash of industries, as workshops sprung up around the city like rival camps of builders. The lives of engineers in an army were difficult and often thankless. They labored under the sun, their hands blistered, their bodies weary, while arrows rained down from the walls. They built under fire, their tools clattering even as stones crashed around them. Many died not by sword but by the sheer hazard of their work, crushed beneath falling timbers, burned by flaming missiles, or buried in collapsed tunnels. Yet their contributions decided the fate of cities. A breach opened by a ram, a wall scaled by a tower, a gate shattered by fire. These were the moments that broke defenses, and they were the fruits of engineering more than brute strength. The materials needed for these machines strained the logistics of every army. Timber had to be cut in massive quantities, sometimes stripping entire forests around a besieged city. Iron had to be forged for bolts, nails, and caps. Rope was twisted from hemp, sinew, or hair, requiring endless supplies of raw fibers. Armies often brought their own stockpiles, but more often they took from the land, requisitioning wood, leather, and metal from surrounding villages. The burden fell on the local population, who watched their trees vanish, their tools melted down, their homes torn apart to fuel the war machines of their conquerors. For the defenders, the struggle was equally industrious. They built countermachines upon their walls, hurling stones back at the attackers. They poured boiling water, oil, or molten metal upon siege towers as they drew near. They reinforced gates with extra timbers, braced walls with earth, dug countermines to collapse the tunnels of their enemies. Cities under siege became vast workshops as well, every citizen drawn into the labor of survival. Women carried stones to the battlements, children gathered water to quench fires, elders sharpened stakes or wove ropes. The clash of siege was not only between armies but between societies, each straining its labor and ingenuity against the other. History is filled with tales of sieges where engineering triumphed over courage. At Tyre, Alexander the Great faced a city upon an island, unreachable by land. His engineers built a causeway, stone by stone, timber by timber, until the sea was filled and his army could march across. It was a feat of persistence as much as violence, a reminder that war was not always won by swords but by shovels and hammers. At Marsada, the Romans built a massive ramp to storm the fortress perched upon a cliff, hauling earth and stone until the mountain itself bent to their will. At Syracuse, Archimedes built machines so cunning that Roman ships were seized and overturned by giant claws, a single mind shaping the defense of a city against an empire. These stories show how war in the ancient world was as much an engineer's struggle as a soldier's. The soundscape of siege was unlike any other. The groan of wooden wheels as towers rolled forward, the thunder of rams striking gates, the hiss of stones launched from catapults, the crack of splintering beams, the roar of defenders as walls shuddered, the cries of laborers as they toiled under fire. Together these sounds formed a grim symphony. Night offered little respite, for engineers worked by torchlight, their silhouettes bent over timbers, their shadows flickering against the walls they sought to topple. Smoke and dust filled the air, mingling with sweat and blood, until the city itself seemed to tremble beneath the strain. When at last the walls broke, it was the engineers' victory. Soldiers poured through the breaches, but the breach existed because craftsmen had labored for days or weeks to make it so. The fall of cities was written in the language of machines as much as of men. And when the dust settled and the conquerors entered, the engineers often turned at once to rebuilding, mending what they had destroyed, for cities needed walls again, and the victors needed protection. The cycle of building and breaking never ceased. In the quiet after a siege, when fires smoldered and bodies lay scattered, one could still find the traces of the engineer's work. Splintered beams, shattered wheels, broken rams, abandoned ladders. These fragments told the story of labor as much as of battle. They were the bones of machines that had decided the fate of kings and peoples. Few remembered the names of the men who built them, yet their work shaped empires. Without them, walls would have stood, gates would have held, and histories would have been written differently. Part 8. Camps and Fortifications. An army on the march was a moving city, but when it halted, it became something even more remarkable, a city raised from the earth in a single evening. Soldiers did not simply throw down their packs and lie upon the ground. They built camps, fortified and ordered, with walls, ditches, streets, kitchens, and quarters. These camps were more than places of rest. They were shields against surprise, containers for supplies, and sanctuaries of order in the chaos of war. To understand the daily life of ancient armies, one must picture not only their battles but also the vast labor of pitching and fortifying camps. The Romans perfected this art. Every day, whether they halted for a night or a season, legions dug ditches, raised ramparts, and set palisades of sharpened stakes. The ground was measured carefully, the camp laid out with geometric precision, streets running straight, tents arranged in ordered rows, gates placed at strategic points. Within, the general's tent stood at the center, surrounded by quarters for officers, barracks for soldiers, and enclosures for animals. Storehouses were marked, kitchens built, latrines dug at proper distances. The camp became a replica of the order of Rome itself, imposed upon the wildness of foreign lands. Soldiers, weary from marching, found no rest until they had raised their walls. Yet this discipline gave them security, for even in hostile country, they slept behind defenses of their own making. Other armies built camps as well, though not always with such rigor. Greeks pitched tents in clusters, often fortified with ditches or wagons drawn into circles. Persians, with their vast numbers, raised sprawling camps that resembled temporary cities, their size alone deterring attack. Nomadic peoples used their wagons as fortresses, circling them to form barriers against enemies. Wherever armies paused, they built, for to sleep unguarded was to invite destruction. Night raids, ambushes, and surprise assaults were constant threats, and only walls, even hastily made, could shield an army from disaster. The labor of camp building was immense. Soldiers who had marched all day with heavy loads were handed shovels, picks, and axes. They dug trenches, heaped the earth into ramparts, and drove stakes into the ground. Sweat ran down their faces as the sun set, their backs ached, their arms grew heavy. Yet they worked on, for they knew that safety lay not in rest but in walls. Fires were lit, kitchens set up, and the smell of cooking grain and meat rose into the air. The sounds of hammers and saws mixed with the crackle of flames and the murmur of voices. In a few hours, bare earth became a fortress of men. These camps were more than protection. They were also centers of logistics. Supplies were stored in neat rows, wagons parked in ordered lines, animals corralled and tethered. Workshops sprang up within, where smiths and carpenters continued their labors. Wells were dug when no rivers were near, cisterns built to collect rain. Medical tents were set up to tend the wounded, chapels or altars raised for prayers and sacrifices. The camp became a self-contained world, able to endure for weeks if needed. It was a city in miniature, breathing with the rhythm of the army, growing and shrinking as it moved across the land. Life inside the camp followed its own order. Guards stood at the gates and along the walls, keeping watch through the night. Soldiers slept in groups within their tents, their weapons close at hand. Fires glowed along the streets, casting flickering light upon canvas and leather. The murmur of conversation, the neigh of horses, the bray of donkeys, and the groan of oxen filled the night air. Even in rest, the camp was alive with sound. Yet beneath it all was a sense of safety, for within the ramparts, men felt secure enough to sleep, knowing that their comrades and their walls would protect them. The design of camps often reflected the character of the armies. Roman camps were grids of discipline, reflecting their love of order and control. Persian camps were grand and expansive, reflecting the wealth and scale of their empire. Greek camps were more modest, suited to citizen soldiers who fought close to home. Nomadic camps were flexible, ready to move at a moment's notice. Each culture built in its own way, but all recognized that a camp was as essential to war as the spear or the sword. It was the place where armies regained their strength, stored their lifeblood of supplies, and prepared for the battles to come. For the common soldier, the camp was home. His tent, though small and cramped, was his shelter from wind and rain. His fire was his comfort, his comrades his family. He ate, slept, and dreamed within its canvas walls, rising each day to march or to fight. Memories were made in these humble quarters, laughter over shared rations, grief over lost friends, the quiet moments of reflection before battle. The camp was where the soldier lived his life, day by day, more than the battlefield where he risked his death. Fortifications were not only temporary. Armies often built longer-lasting defenses, forts, watchtowers, and walls that marked the land with their presence. The Romans scattered forts across their empire, garrisoning soldiers in stone barracks, ensuring roads and provinces remained safe. The Persians did the same along their frontiers, building fortresses to guard against nomadic incursions. The Chinese raised great walls, stretching for miles across mountains and plains, fed and supplied by camps and garrisons stationed along their length. These fortifications were not merely military, they were symbols of control, the visible imprint of empire upon the landscape. To build such works demanded immense labor. Soldiers became masons, hauling stones and stacking them into walls. They cut timber for towers, dug ditches, and filled them with water. Fortresses rose from the earth like mountains, shaping the land into instruments of power. Behind their walls, armies stored supplies, trained recruits, and waited for war. The line between camp and city blurred, as temporary shelters became permanent settlements, shaping history in ways that outlasted the armies themselves. The memory of camp life lingered in the hearts of soldiers long after campaigns ended. They remembered the smell of wood smoke at dusk, the glow of torches along the ramparts, the murmur of voices drifting into the night. They remembered the rhythm of building walls, the comfort of sleeping under canvas, the sense of safety within the ordered streets. For many, the camp was more real than the battlefield, for it was where they spent most of their time. It was there that they forged bonds, endured hardships, and dreamed of home. When morning came, the camp came alive with noise and motion. Fires were stoked, rations prepared, animals harnessed. Tents were struck, stakes pulled from the ground, ditches filled in. Within hours, the city vanished, leaving only faint marks upon the earth. The army moved on, but the memory of the camp lingered in the soil, faint scars upon the land where men had lived and labored. The cycle repeated itself again and again. March, build, sleep, dismantle, march. This was the heartbeat of ancient armies, the rhythm that sustained them. The story of war is incomplete without these camps and fortifications. They were the hidden side of battle, the places where men lived and where armies truly endured. Without them, soldiers would have been scattered, vulnerable, and disordered. With them, they became a community, bound together by walls and fire. The camp was the army's second skin, raised each evening, shed each morning, but always present. Part 9. Logistics in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Long before the legions of Rome or the phalanxes of Greece, there were armies that rose along the great rivers of the ancient world. Egypt and Mesopotamia, the two great cradles of early civilization, built their strength upon water and grain. Their soldiers marched with spears and chariots, but behind them stood a system of supply that was as old as the fields that lined the Nile and the twin rivers of Mesopotamia. To understand war in these lands is to understand the intimate marriage of geography and logistics. For armies there did not simply rely on bravery but upon the steady pulse of rivers, harvests, and storehouses. Egypt was blessed with the Nile, a river so regular and generous that it gave birth to an entire civilization. Each year its floods deposited black silt across the valley, renewing the fields and ensuring abundant harvests. Grain poured from these fields into granaries, stored in vast silos controlled by temples and the crown. When Pharaoh raised his armies, he did so with the confidence that food would follow them, carried upon the waters of the river. Boats became the arteries of Egyptian war. Long, narrow vessels loaded with sacks of barley and wheat drifted with the current, pulled by rowers or sails, feeding the armies that marched upon the banks. In Egypt, The Nile was both road and storehouse, ensuring that no army ever strayed far from its lifeline. The pharaohs relied upon this abundance to sustain their military ventures. When they marched into Nubia, Libya, or the Levant, convoys of boats carried provisions behind them. Soldiers received bread baked from the grain of the valley, dried fish from the river, and beer brewed thick and nourishing. These rations were not luxuries but dependable staples, and they allowed Egyptian armies to endure in lands where supplies were scarcer. Temples played a central role, for their granaries held the wealth of the land, and their officials managed the flow of provisions. War in Egypt was inseparable from religion, and logistics was overseen by priests as much as by generals. Every loaf of bread handed to a soldier had passed through the careful accounting of scribes, who recorded harvests, measured rations, and ensured that the army remained fed. Chariots, the pride of the Egyptian army, demanded their own logistics. Each team of horses required fodder, each chariot spare parts for wheels and axles. Craftsmen followed the army to maintain these machines, their workshops buzzing with activity as they repaired broken frames or shod horses with new fittings. An Egyptian army on the march was not just a line of warriors but a procession of carts, animals, laborers, and scribes, all sustained by the river that flowed at their side. Even in battle, the Nile was never far from their thoughts, for to be cut off from it was to risk starvation and collapse. Mesopotamia, by contrast, was a land of dual rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, whose moods were far less predictable. Their floods could be destructive, sweeping away villages and fields, or they could be meager, leaving the land parched. To control them required canals, levees, and irrigation, a vast system of human labor that turned chaos into fertility. This labor also shaped war. Armies marched along the rivers and canals, their supplies floating behind them in barges. Cities built along these waterways became storehouses of grain, feeding soldiers as well as citizens. To capture a city was to capture its granaries, its canals, and the power to feed thousands. The kings of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria all understood this truth. They raised armies not merely of warriors but of administrators, scribes, and laborers who ensured that soldiers received their daily bread. Inscriptions carved upon stone often boasted of conquests, but beneath the glory lay the silent machinery of supply. Temples, like those in Egypt, were central. Their storehouses overflowed with grain collected as tax, and this grain was redistributed to armies in times of war. Priests and officials recorded every measure, their clay tablets filled with numbers that told the true story of war. Victory was often determined not by the clash of armies but by the ability to sustain them in the field. The Assyrians, who rose to dominate Mesopotamia with their ferocity, also mastered logistics. Their armies marched with thousands of soldiers, supported by chariots, cavalry, and siege engines. To feed such a force required immense preparation. Caravans of donkeys and oxen carried supplies, while rivers bore barges loaded with grain and water. The Assyrians built depots along their roads, ensuring that armies could draw provisions as they advanced. They also practiced ruthless tactics, stripping conquered lands of food and resettling populations to control agriculture. For them, logistics was not only a support system but a weapon. By denying their enemies food, they weakened them before battle had even begun. The daily rations of Mesopotamian soldiers resembled those of their Egyptian counterparts: bread, beer, dried dates, and onions. These foods were chosen not for luxury but for their durability and nourishment. Soldiers drank thick beer, often consumed through straws from jars, and ate bread baked hard to last through marches. The taste may have been monotonous, but it gave them the strength to endure. Animals were fed on barley and straw, their needs carefully balanced against those of the men. Each campaign became a delicate equation, measured in sacks of grain, jars of beer, and herds of animals. The geography of Mesopotamia also shaped its wars. Flat and open, it offered little natural protection, so cities built walls of brick and stone. Sieges became common, and with them the logistics of both attacker and defender grew more complex. Armies surrounding a city needed constant resupply, often relying on rivers to carry provisions. Defenders within the walls depended on stored grain and water drawn from wells or canals. The longer the siege, the greater the strain on both sides. Victories here were as much about endurance as about weapons, and endurance depended on logistics. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, logistics was inseparable from administration. The early states that rose in these lands were built around the control of food and water, and their armies were natural extensions of that control. Pharaohs and kings commanded not only warriors but entire systems of scribes, priests, and laborers who managed resources. The clay tablet inscribed with measures of grain was as much a weapon as the spear, for it ensured that the spear-bearer remained strong. The temple granary was as important as the armory, for without bread, no sword could be lifted. We must imagine the daily rhythm of these armies to see them clearly. Soldiers waking at dawn, their rations distributed by officials, animals tethered and fed with barley straw, barges loaded with sacks of grain, drifting down the river under the morning sun, scribes bent over their tablets, marking each transaction with precise strokes. Behind the noise of marching feet lay the quieter sounds of war, the rustle of grain poured into sacks, the slosh of beer in jars, the creak of barges upon the water. These were the sounds of armies that understood, perhaps better than any who came after, that war was sustained by food and water above all. Egypt and Mesopotamia laid the foundation for all who followed. Their rivers taught the world that geography is destiny and logistics, that armies must march with the flow of water or perish without it. Their temples and scribes showed that administration is as vital as courage, that numbers written in clay or papyrus decide wars as surely as swords. Their armies proved that the hidden army of logistics is as old as civilization itself, and that without it, no empire could rise or endure. Part 10. Logistics in Greece. The rugged land of Greece, cut by mountains and surrounded by the restless sea, gave birth to a way of war unlike that of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Here, armies were smaller, drawn from citizen soldiers rather than professional legions, and their campaigns were shaped as much by geography as by politics. The Greek hoplite, standing in the phalanx with his spear and shield, may be the image most remembered, but behind him lay the same eternal problem faced by all soldiers: how to eat, drink, and march across a land that offered little generosity. To understand Greek warfare, one must look beyond the clashing of shields and see the ships that carried grain, the carts that hauled supplies, and the quiet routines of men sustaining themselves in harsh conditions. The Greek mainland was not a land of abundance. Its soil was thin, its fields small, and its harvests uncertain. Wheat grew poorly in many places, so barley became the staple, baked into flat loaves or boiled into porridge. Olives and wine were abundant, but these were complements, not meals in themselves. Armies marching far from home could not count on fertile valleys to feed them as the Egyptians had along the Nile. They had to carry their food or ensure it followed them by sea. Campaigns were often short, timed with harvests so that soldiers could return to tend their fields, and also so that armies could seize grain when it was ripe. War in Greece was tied to the rhythm of agriculture, as every general knew that without food, soldiers would drift back to their homes before the enemy was defeated. The hoplite carried part of his burden on his own back. Alongside his armor, shield, and spear, he brought rations of barley meal, cheese, onions, and dried figures. These were durable, easy to carry, and enough to sustain him for a few days. But beyond that, He depended on supply wagons or on ships shadowing the coast. Naval power was therefore not only about battle at sea but about feeding armies on land. The trireme, sleek and swift, was supported by fleets of transport vessels that carried grain, wine, and other provisions. When Greek armies campaigned across the Aegean, they did so with confidence because their supplies could sail behind them. To lose control of the sea was to lose the ability to sustain war. This truth became clear in the Peloponnesian War, when Athens, a city bound to the sea, clashed with Sparta, a land power. Athens drew its grain from distant lands, particularly from the fertile regions around the Black Sea, and its ships ensured that food reached the city even when enemies ravaged its countryside. Spartan armies could burn fields, but they could not starve Athens so long as its ships brought grain to the Piraeus. For years, this lifeline kept Athens alive, even as war drained its people. Only when Sparta, with Persian support, built a fleet to challenge Athenian supremacy did the balance shift. Once Athenian supply lines by sea were cut, the city began to weaken, its lifeline severed by the loss of the waters it had long commanded. The Spartan system of supply was different. Sparta's armies were small but disciplined, their campaigns shorter and closer to home. Spartan warriors, supported by the labor of the Helot population, could march with fewer concerns about food, for their helots carried much of the burden. Grain, wine, and meat were borne on the backs of these enslaved laborers, who followed the army in great numbers, feeding their masters as they fought. In this way, Sparta's logistics were entwined with its social system, sustained by the subjugation of others. Yet even Spartans could not march far without careful planning, and their dependence on land routes limited their reach. Greek armies that ventured abroad often struggled. When they marched inland, away from coasts and ships, they faced hunger and hardship. The famous retreat of the 10,000, immortalized by Xenophon, revealed this clearly. These mercenaries, stranded deep in Persian territory, were forced to forage constantly, taking grain from villages, seizing animals, and bargaining for food. Each day was a battle against hunger as much as against enemies. They crossed rivers swollen with spring floods, climbed mountains where supplies dwindled, and trudged through deserts where water was scarce. The story of their endurance was not only one of courage but of logistics under constant strain. Their survival depended on discipline, resourcefulness, and the willingness to take by force what the land and its people held. The diet of Greek soldiers reflected the realities of their land. Barley bread, cheese, olives, and wine formed the foundation. Meat was rarer, often eaten only after sacrifices or victories. Fish supplemented rations when campaigns hugged the coast, but inland armies depended heavily on what they could carry. Wine diluted with water was a daily staple, both for safety and for morale. Soldiers gathered in groups to eat together, their meals simple but binding them in fellowship. Around campfires they shared not only food but stories and songs, reminding themselves of the homes they had left behind. For citizen soldiers, war was always a temporary departure from life, not a permanent profession, and the simplicity of their meals reflected this. The building of camps in Greece was less elaborate than in Rome but no less essential. Armies often encircled themselves with ditches or wagons, lighting fires and placing guards. Supply wagons were parked in the rear, animals tethered nearby. Women and slaves followed, preparing food and carrying loads. The hum of such camps was quieter than those of later empires, but the needs were the same. Food had to be stored, animals watered, weapons maintained. Even in their modest scale, Greek camps were miniature cities, fragile but vital. Naval logistics in Greece deserve special attention, for the sea was as important to Greek warfare as the land. The trireme, with its 3 banks of oars, was a hungry beast, requiring 170 rowers, each of whom consumed grain, cheese, and wine daily. To feed a fleet meant organizing convoys of supply ships, docking at friendly ports, and securing lines of trade. A trireme could not remain long at sea without constant resupply. Naval bases became as vital as forts, places where fleets could rest, repair, and feed their men. War in the Aegean was therefore a dance not only of ships but of provisions. The ingenuity of the Greeks also extended to their siege warfare, though on a smaller scale than that of later empires. Their machines were simpler, their resources fewer, but they understood that a siege was a battle of endurance. Armies surrounding a city needed supplies as much as those within. The Athenians, during their campaigns, often struggled to keep their troops fed in hostile lands. Supply ships became lifelines, and when storms or enemies cut them off, soldiers grew restless. Logistics shaped even their greatest triumphs and their most crushing defeats, always in the background, always decisive. The Greek world was divided among city-states, each with its own methods and resources. Athens, with its fleets, depended on trade and overseas supply. Sparta, with its helots, depended on land and forced labor. Smaller cities adapted as they could, drawing on local harvests and allies. Yet all shared the same truth. War was sustained not by bravery alone but by bread and wine, by carts and ships, by the humble routines of men ensuring that stomachs were filled. When we picture the Greek phalanx advancing, shields overlapping, spears bristling like a wall of iron, we must also imagine the wagons rumbling behind, the ships riding the waves nearby, the slaves and servants carrying sacks of grain. Without them, the phalanx would falter, its strength broken by hunger long before the clash of spears. Greek warfare was a marriage of courage and necessity, of strategy and supply. In the stillness of night, when armies camped beneath the stars of Attica or beside the waters of the Aegean, soldiers ate their barley bread, sipped their watered wine, and lay down upon the ground. The sounds of animals drifted through the camp, the murmur of waves against the shore, the crackle of fires. They dreamed of home, but in their dreams as in their waking life, they were sustained by the unglamorous machinery of logistics. It was this machinery, quiet and constant, that allowed their wars to be fought at all. Part 11. Logistics in Rome. The greatness of Rome did not rest only upon the bravery of its legions or the brilliance of its generals. It rested upon a system of logistics so disciplined and far-reaching that it allowed armies to march for years across foreign lands, always supplied, always ready, always steady. If other civilizations learned to feed their soldiers, Rome perfected the art, turning supply into a science and administration into a weapon as sharp as any sword. To understand Roman conquest, one must first understand Roman logistics, for it was the hidden machine that made empire possible. From the moment a legion set out on campaign, order followed. Soldiers carried part of their burden on their own backs, rations of grain, equipment, tools, and personal belongings. Yet this was only the beginning. Wagons drawn by mules and oxen carried additional supplies. Herds of animals followed for slaughter, and long lines of camp followers trudged behind, bearing everything from cooking pots to medical gear. Each legion was not simply a fighting force but a moving community, organized down to the smallest detail. Officers knew exactly how much grain was required each day, how many animals needed fodder, how much wine or vinegar was necessary to keep morale steady. Nothing was left to chance. The Roman diet on campaign reflected their pragmatism. Wheat was the foundation, issued as grain to be ground by the soldiers themselves. Each man carried a hand mill, and at evening, groups gathered to grind flour, knead dough, and bake rough loaves upon flat stones or in clay ovens hastily built. Salt was added when available, vinegar mixed with water to form posca, a sour but refreshing drink. Meat was eaten when herds were available or when plunder brought fresh animals into camp, but it was never the staple. Rome's legions were sustained primarily on bread, the food of civilization itself, carried from the fields of their empire to the mouths of their soldiers. What made Roman logistics unique was the scale of its organization. Grain was collected in provinces as tax, stored in vast granaries, and shipped to where it was needed. Egypt, with its fertile Nile Valley, became the breadbasket of Rome, sending millions of bushels across the Mediterranean to feed both the capital and the armies. Africa and Sicily added their harvests, ensuring that the flow of food never ceased. Ships carried grain to ports, from where it was loaded onto wagons that rolled along the roads of empire, finally reaching the camps of legions stationed at distant frontiers. The entire empire became a network of supply, a great machine designed to sustain war. The Roman roads were its arteries. Paved with stone, graded for drainage, and stretching for thousands of kilometers, they allowed wagons to move swiftly and armies to march with ease. Milestones marked distances, inns and stations provided rest, and depots stored supplies along the way. To march along a Roman road was to march within a system of order, where logistics flowed as smoothly as water down a channel. When enemies faced the legions, they faced not only soldiers but the roads, bridges, and storehouses that fed them. Rome fought with stone as much as with steel. Camps added another layer of security. Each night, legions dug ditches, raised ramparts, and built ordered streets. Within these walls, supplies were stored, animals tethered, and workshops set up. Granaries were built to keep food dry, ovens to bake bread, wells to draw water. The camp became a miniature city, self-sufficient and secure, capable of withstanding sudden attack. This discipline ensured that Roman armies were rarely caught unprepared. Even in foreign lands, they carried the order of Rome with them, shaping the landscape into a mirror of their empire. The Romans also mastered the sea. Fleets of grain ships crossed the Mediterranean, escorted by warships to protect them from pirates. Harbors like Ostia near Rome became hubs of supply, their warehouses filled with sacks of grain waiting to be distributed. When legions campaigned abroad, fleets shadowed them along coasts, carrying provisions too heavy for wagons. Amphorae of wine, oil, and garum were loaded aboard, their clay jars stacked in neat rows, ready to be carried ashore when needed. The sea, like the roads, became part of Rome's logistical machine, binding distant lands into a single system of war and trade. Numbers guided everything. Roman officials, called quaestors, managed supplies with meticulous care. They recorded how much grain was distributed, how many animals were consumed, how much pay was owed to soldiers. Their accounts ensured that nothing was wasted and that shortages were anticipated before they became disasters. This administrative precision was one of Rome's greatest strengths. Other armies faltered when supplies ran low. Rome's legions marched steadily because their leaders knew exactly how much remained in their storehouses and where the next shipment was already on its way. The discipline of Roman logistics extended even into punishment. Soldiers were expected to care for their equipment and provisions. Negligence was not tolerated, for a dull sword or spoiled ration endangered the entire legion. Men who wasted food or failed to maintain their gear faced harsh penalties. This strictness ensured that every soldier took responsibility for the hidden machinery of war, becoming not only a fighter but a caretaker of supplies. In this way, the legion was more than a battlefield unit. It was a logistical organism, each part sustaining the whole. Rome's mastery of logistics allowed it to fight wars of endurance. In Gaul, Caesar's campaigns stretched for years, yet his legions never starved. Grain flowed from allied tribes, from storehouses, from the fields of Italy itself. In distant Britain, legions landed with fleets that carried provisions across the Channel, establishing depots as they advanced. Along the Rhine and Danube, forts stored food and weapons, ensuring that armies could withstand long winters. Even in the deserts of the east, Rome's roads and depots allowed its soldiers to survive where others would have perished. The empire expanded not only through courage but through the patient work of supply. Defeat often came when logistics failed. Armies cut off from their lines of supply grew weak, restless, and vulnerable. Enemies who learned to attack wagons or burn depots could cripple entire campaigns without facing the legions in open battle. Rome understood this, and so it guarded its supplies as fiercely as its standards. Convoys were protected by soldiers, depots fortified with walls, roads patrolled against raiders. Logistics was treated as a battlefield of its own, one where victory meant endurance and failure meant ruin. The daily life of a Roman soldier reflected this constant attention to supply. At dawn, he might grind grain into flour, bake bread, and eat before marching. At midday, he drank posca to refresh himself under the sun. At evening, he helped raise the camp, digging ditches, building ovens, and storing provisions. His strength came not only from training but from the steady rhythm of food, drink, and order. He trusted that the empire behind him would provide, and in that trust lay his endurance. Rome's logistics became so refined that it shaped the empire itself. Provinces were valued not only for their tribute but for their harvests. Roads were built not merely for trade but for armies. Cities grew around forts and depots, becoming permanent settlements that outlasted the campaigns they had supported. The empire's very shape reflected the needs of its legions, with fertile lands feeding distant frontiers, rivers carrying supplies, and harbors binding coasts into unity. Rome's power was not simply military. It was logistical, a vast web that allowed soldiers to stand ready at any point of the empire. When we picture the legions, their shields gleaming in the sun, their standards rising above the dust, we must also imagine the unseen world behind them. The granaries of Egypt, the ships of Sicily, the roads of Gaul, the camps of Germania. These were as much the legion's weapons as its swords and spears. Rome's victories were written not only in blood but in bread, not only in battles but in bushels of grain. Logistics was the silent general of Rome, commanding without voice, shaping destiny without glory. Part 12. Logistics in Persia and Asia. East of the Mediterranean, across deserts, mountains, and fertile plains, lay empires whose scale rivaled or surpassed Rome's, and whose logistics were shaped by the vastness of their lands. Persia, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, and the kingdoms of Asia further east, including the great dynasties of India and China, all faced the same eternal challenge: how to feed, move, and sustain armies over distances so immense that men seemed like ants upon the earth. Their solutions, though varied, reveal the ingenuity of civilizations that understood war not only as a clash of arms but as an unending struggle with supply. The Persian Empire of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes was bound together by the royal road, a marvel of administration and engineering. Stretching for thousands of kilometers from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in the east, it allowed armies, messengers, and supplies to move with a speed unknown elsewhere in the ancient world. Along this road, stations were built at regular intervals, where fresh horses awaited couriers and provisions were stored for troops. The system was so efficient that messages could travel across the empire in days rather than months, and armies marching along its length could be fed from depots prepared in advance. When Xerxes led his massive invasion of Greece, it was the royal road and the empire's stockpiled resources that allowed him to assemble such a vast host, even if in the end the limits of supply still caught up with him. Persian logistics relied heavily on tribute. Provinces across the empire sent not only gold and silver but grain, livestock, and wine. These flowed into royal storehouses, ready to be drawn upon when war called. Armies moved like harvests across the land, gathering food from loyal satrapies, requisitioning supplies from subject peoples. Their diet was varied, reflecting the richness of the empire. Wheat and barley from Mesopotamia, dates from Babylon, wine from Anatolia, fruits from the Levant, spices from the east. Yet even the wealth of Persia could not overcome the basic laws of distance. As Xerxes' army crossed into Greece, it devoured the land like a swarm, consuming supplies faster than they could be delivered. Rivers were said to run dry under the thirst of men and animals. The royal road gave speed, but it could not feed forever. India offered another model. There, armies relied heavily on elephants, beasts that demanded enormous quantities of fodder but offered immense power in return. Feeding an elephant was a logistical challenge greater than feeding a dozen men, for it consumed hundreds of pounds of vegetation each day and vast amounts of water. Armies that used them had to plan their routes around rivers, forests, and fields capable of sustaining these giants. Yet their presence changed the nature of war, for they could trample enemies, carry towers of archers, and terrify foes unused to their sight. Indian rulers built systems of supply not only for men but for these animals, creating camps where fodder was stored in advance and rivers guarded for their water. The elephant was not just a weapon but a logistical burden that shaped the very path of campaigns. The Persians, when they clashed with Indian kingdoms, adopted elephants themselves, bringing them westward into their armies. Later, Alexander the Great would face them at the Battle of the High Dasps, where the Indian king Porus deployed elephants in long lines. Alexander's men, unused to the creatures, recoiled in fear, but he eventually outmaneuvered them. Yet the sight of those giants left a mark, and elephants became part of the imagination of war across Asia. Behind their terror, however, stood endless supplies of fodder and water, the hidden cost of their power. Further east, in China, logistics reached levels of organization that rivaled and often surpassed those of the West. The Warring States period, with its constant conflicts, forced rulers to develop vast systems of supply. Armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands could not exist without granaries, canals, and roads built specifically to feed them. Grain was the lifeblood of Chinese armies, and states built immense storage depots along their frontiers. Canals linked rivers, carrying barges loaded with food to garrisons stationed at the edges of the realm. Roads allowed carts to follow armies across plains and valleys. Every campaign was preceded by careful stockpiling, sometimes for years, before a single soldier marched. The Qin dynasty, which eventually unified China, mastered this system. Its rulers organized agriculture with military precision, ensuring that every harvest fed not only the people but also the soldiers who expanded their rule. They built roads across mountains, dug canals to link rivers, and raised granaries along the Great Wall to supply soldiers guarding against nomadic incursions. The Chinese approach to logistics was as systematic as their approach to government: meticulous, centralized, and relentless. Their records describe the rations of soldiers in detail: measures of millet, beans, and dried meat carefully weighed and distributed. They also understood the need to rotate garrisons, moving men so that no single region was drained of supplies for too long. Like Rome, China's strength lay not only in its armies but in its infrastructure. The Great Wall itself, stretching across northern frontiers, was less a single wall than a system of forts, depots, and roads. Soldiers stationed there were sustained by granaries built at intervals, supplied by caravans that followed the roads and canals. The wall was as much a logistical achievement as a military one, a line of supply as much as a line of defense. Without the steady flow of food, water, and tools, its stones would have been meaningless. The daily life of Persian, Indian, and Chinese soldiers reflected these logistical systems. Persian troops ate bread, dates, fruits, and drank wine, supplied from the abundance of their empire. Indian soldiers received rice, lentils, and meat, cooked in great pots over campfires, often supplemented with the milk of cattle that marched with the army. Chinese soldiers consumed millet porridge, beans, and dried vegetables, their meals measured with bureaucratic precision. All depended on the labor of countless workers: farmers who grew the grain, laborers who built the roads and canals, drivers who led the wagons, sailors who rowed the barges, and administrators who recorded every measure. Behind every soldier stood a nation organized for war. Geography shaped their struggles as much as abundance. In Persia, deserts stretched vast and unforgiving, forcing armies to carry water skins, to march at night, to seek oases hidden among sands. In India, monsoons turned roads to rivers, delaying supplies and spoiling food. In China, mountains and rivers forced armies to split or to wait for bridges and ferries, their supplies piling up until crossings could be made. The landscape was as much an enemy as any rival, and logistics was the art of overcoming it. The stories of failure in these lands are as telling as those of success. Xerxes' invasion of Greece faltered not because his soldiers lacked courage, but because his supplies could not keep pace with his host. Alexander's men nearly perished in the Gedrosian desert, thirst consuming them faster than any foe. Chinese dynasties fell when corruption or mismanagement emptied granaries, leaving soldiers hungry and revolts unchecked. Logistics was always the fragile chain upon which empires dangled, a chain that could snap with a bad harvest, a failed canal, or a burned depot. Yet these civilizations endured for centuries because they understood logistics not as an afterthought but as the heart of war. Persia built its roads, India bred its elephants and organized their fodder, China constructed canals and granaries. Each empire adapted to its land, turning geography into a tool rather than an obstacle. They taught the world that war was not only about bravery and weapons but about roads, rivers, and food. Their achievements in logistics were as great as their palaces and temples, though far less celebrated. In the stillness of night, Persian camps glowed with fires where bread was baked and wine poured. In India, the low rumble of elephants mixed with the laughter of men eating rice and lentils by torchlight. In China, soldiers gathered around bowls of millet porridge, their rations measured by officials, their discipline sustained by order. These scenes, repeated across centuries and continents, remind us that the heart of war has always been the same. Men and animals must eat, drink, and rest, and it is the system that ensures this which decides whether empires rise or fall. Part 13. Logistics in China. Nowhere in the ancient world did the scale of armies or the demands of logistics reach greater heights than in China. From the Warring States period through the Qin and Han dynasties, rulers commanded forces that dwarfed those of Greece and Rome. Tens of thousands of soldiers were considered modest numbers. Hundreds of thousands were more typical. Such vast armies required not only courage and weapons but a system of supply that could feed, clothe, and arm them across great distances and long campaigns. In China, logistics was not a hidden concern whispered among generals. It was a central discipline of statecraft, woven into the very structure of government. The geography of China shaped this reality. Vast rivers like the Yellow River and the Yangtze flowed across fertile plains, carrying life-giving silt to the fields. Agriculture thrived, producing millet, rice, beans, and wheat, which became the foundation of both population and armies. Yet the same geography presented obstacles: mountains in the west, deserts in the north, jungles in the south. To campaign across these varied landscapes required foresight and organization of the highest order. Chinese rulers learned to build not only armies of men but armies of administrators, laborers, and engineers, whose work ensured that soldiers marched with full stomachs and steady supplies. The Warring States period was the crucible where these systems developed. Rival kingdoms clashed constantly, each fielding massive armies. To support them, rulers built granaries across their lands, storing the harvest in years of plenty to feed soldiers in times of war. Roads were constructed to link these depots, allowing carts and animals to move grain swiftly. Canals were dug to connect rivers, turning the land into a web of watery highways along which barges carried food, weapons, and materials. Every campaign began long before the march, with years of stockpiling and preparation. Generals who ignored this reality found their soldiers starving before they met the enemy. Those who mastered it marched with confidence, their armies fed by the discipline of their states. The Qin dynasty, which emerged victorious from this struggle, carried logistics to new heights. Its rulers were relentless in their organization. Agriculture was placed under strict control, with peasants taxed in grain that filled state granaries. These stores were then used to support vast armies that conquered rival states and unified China. Roads were extended across the realm, straight and broad, built not only for trade but for war. Canals linked rivers, carrying food to garrisons stationed at the edges of empire. Soldiers marching with Qin armies could rely on depots placed at intervals along their routes, ensuring that supplies awaited them wherever they went. This system allowed the Qin to mobilize numbers that astonished the ancient world, creating armies so vast that their very presence overwhelmed their foes. The Han dynasty, which succeeded the Qin, inherited and refined this system. It established permanent garrisons along its frontiers, each supplied by networks of roads and canals. Granaries were built near the Great Wall, ensuring that soldiers defending against nomadic incursions could endure the long winters of the north. Officials carefully measured rations, millet and rice for the men, beans and fodder for the animals, dried meat and vegetables to supplement the diet. The state oversaw everything, recording harvests, distributing supplies, and rotating soldiers to prevent any one region from being drained of resources. Logistics in Han China was a machine of staggering complexity, designed to sustain both empire and army. The scale of Chinese armies demanded precision. A force of 200,000 men, with horses, oxen, and equipment, consumed unimaginable amounts of food each day. Without canals and roads, such numbers could not move far without starving. The Chinese solution was to extend their infrastructure outward with the army itself. As soldiers advanced, laborers followed, digging canals, repairing roads, and building depots. In this way, the logistical chain lengthened with every step, binding the army to the land in a network of supply that could reach across mountains and plains. This was not improvisation but a deliberate strategy, planned by officials who understood that the fate of campaigns rested upon the steady flow of food and water. Chinese military texts, like the writings attributed to Sun Tzu, reflected this understanding. They warned that war was costly not only in blood but in resources, that the longer an army stayed in the field, the heavier the burden upon the state. They emphasized the need to strike swiftly, to feed armies on the land when possible, but always with caution, for exhausting the countryside invited rebellion. These texts reveal that logistics was not an afterthought but a constant concern of Chinese generals. They measured victory not only by battles won but by the efficiency with which their soldiers were supplied. The daily life of a Chinese soldier reflected the discipline of this system. Rations were distributed in measured portions, often of millet or rice, cooked into porridge or steamed into cakes. Soldiers ate in groups, their meals simple but reliable. Water was carried in jars or drawn from rivers, often boiled for safety. Tools were provided for cooking, for digging, and for repairing equipment. Soldiers were expected not only to fight but to labor, building roads, digging canals, and carrying supplies. The line between soldier and worker was thin, for both served the same end, the endurance of the army. Animals played their part as well. Horses were bred in large numbers for cavalry, requiring steady supplies of fodder. Oxen pulled carts laden with grain, their slow pace matched by the endless movement of supplies. Donkeys and mules carried loads across mountain paths, camels across deserts. Each creature demanded its own food and water, and officials accounted for these needs as carefully as for those of men. The burden was immense, but the organization of the state ensured that it was met. The Great Wall stands as a testament to the logistical power of China. Stretching across thousands of kilometers, it was less a wall than a system of forts, garrisons, and supply lines. Soldiers stationed there required constant provisioning, their rations carried along roads and canals to depots built within the wall itself. Granaries were stocked with grain from the fertile south, transported over long distances to the arid north. Without this system, the wall would have been meaningless, for no army could have endured upon it without food. Its stones are impressive, but its true strength lay in the invisible arteries of supply that sustained it. Failures, when they came, revealed the fragility of even this mighty system. Bad harvests could empty granaries, leaving soldiers hungry. Corruption among officials could divert supplies, weakening armies before battles. Floods could destroy canals, blocking the flow of food. Bandits or enemies who struck at caravans could cripple entire campaigns. The sheer scale of Chinese logistics made it powerful, but also vulnerable, for a single break in the chain could ripple across thousands of soldiers. Yet the resilience of the system lay in its redundancy. Multiple roads, multiple canals, multiple depots ensured that no single disaster brought collapse. When we picture Chinese armies, we must imagine not only the ranks of soldiers in armor, their banners fluttering, their drums beating, but also the endless caravans of carts and animals, the barges drifting down canals, the granaries filled with sacks of millet. We must see the officials bent over records, the laborious digging ditches, the farmers harvesting fields to fill the state stores. We must hear the creak of wheels, the splash of oars, the clatter of grain poured into jars. These were as much the sounds of war as the clash of weapons. China's mastery of logistics gave it resilience unmatched in the ancient world. Its armies could endure longer, fight farther, and recover more swiftly from setbacks because behind them stood a system of supply that was vast, disciplined, and unyielding. Its rulers understood that empire was not only about conquest but about the steady feeding of men. Its generals knew that victory was not only about courage but about the grain in the soldiers' bowls. Logistics was not hidden in China. It was proclaimed in stone, written in texts, built into canals and roads that endure to this day. Part 14. Great Campaigns of Supply. The grand campaigns remembered in history are often told as tales of courage and genius, of generals who led their men through impossible odds to glory. Yet behind these stories lies another tale, quieter but no less decisive, the tale of supply. For no matter how brilliant the strategy, no matter how fierce the soldiers, an army without food, water, and transport soon became a desperate mob. The most famous campaigns of the ancient world, those that still echo in memory, were as much tests of logistics as of battle. To follow them is to see how the hidden army of wagons, animals, and provisions shaped triumph and disaster alike. Alexander the Great's march across Asia is remembered for its daring, but it was sustained by a web of supply that stretched across thousands of kilometers. His army was relatively small compared to the Persian hosts he faced, numbering tens of thousands rather than hundreds, but this was part of his advantage. Smaller numbers meant easier provisioning, and Alexander moved swiftly, feeding his men from depots established in advance and from the lands he conquered. His engineers ensured rivers were crossed, his administrators arranged for grain to be stockpiled along routes, and his navy shadowed him along the coast, bringing supplies when the land could not. Yet even Alexander could not escape the harsh laws of logistics. When he marched into the Jedrosian desert, away from rivers and fertile valleys, his men nearly perished. Thirst consumed them, wagons broke upon the sands, animals collapsed in the heat. Thousands died not from enemy swords but from the absence of water. His genius could carry him through battles, but it could not conjure food and drink from barren earth. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps stands as another testament to the power and peril of logistics. Leading his army from Spain into Italy, he faced not only Roman legions but the mountains themselves. Snow choked the passes, rocks blocked the paths, and his men, burdened with supplies, struggled with every step. Elephants, those giants of Carthage, marched beside them, consuming immense amounts of fodder. To keep his army alive, Hannibal relied on careful stockpiling before the march, seizing grain from friendly tribes, and forcing his men to carry what they could. Still, the losses were terrible. Many soldiers died in the cold, animals slipped upon icy slopes, wagons tumbled into ravines. By the time Hannibal descended into Italy, his force was diminished, but the survivors were hardened by the ordeal. His campaign became legendary, but its memory is inseparable from the image of men trudging through snow, their bellies empty, their animals gaunt, sustained only by the promise of victory. The Roman campaigns themselves were constant tests of supply. Caesar in Gaul waged not only battles but a war of grain. He secured alliances with tribes to feed his legions, built depots across the land, and punished those who denied him provisions. His commentaries speak not only of victories but of foraging, of the need to secure fields and rivers. At Alesia, the famous siege, logistics decided the outcome. Caesar built double walls around the city, one to contain the defenders and one to protect against relief forces. Within these walls he stored food for his legions, ensuring that they could endure while their enemies starved. The defenders of Alesia, cut off from supplies, weakened with each passing day until surrender was inevitable. It was not only the strength of Roman arms that won but the strength of Roman stomachs, fed by foresight and supply. The Persian invasion of Greece under Xerxes revealed both the power and the limits of logistics. His army, vast and splendid, was said to number in the hundreds of thousands. To feed such a force required immense preparation. The royal road carried supplies, storehouses were filled, and fleets shadowed the army with provisions. Yet the sheer size of his host became its weakness. Rivers were drained dry by the thirst of men and animals, fields stripped bare as they passed. No system, however efficient, could keep pace with such hunger. The Greeks, though fewer, were sustained by shorter lines of supply, by ships bringing grain to their coasts, by allies guarding their fields. In the end, Xerxes' might collapsed under its own weight, proving that no army, however grand, could defy the simple truth that men must eat. In China, great campaigns tested logistics even more. Armies of hundreds of thousands marched across plains, fed by canals and granaries. When supplies failed, disaster followed. Records tell of campaigns where soldiers starved, eating bark and grass, or scattering to plunder villages when rations ran out. Victories were won not only by superior numbers but by superior planning, by the ability to keep the flow of millet and rice steady across rivers and mountains. The building of the Great Wall itself was a campaign of logistics, where supplies had to be carried across arid lands to feed the laborers and soldiers who raised its stones. The wall rose not by courage alone but by sacks of grain hauled mile after mile, year after year. Even smaller campaigns reveal the weight of logistics. Greek hoplites fighting in foreign lands carried their barley meal and cheese, but when it ran out, they foraged desperately. Mercenary armies often lived by plunder, seizing grain and livestock from the lands they crossed. Their discipline often frayed under hunger, leading to mutinies or disbandment. The retreat of the 10,000 is remembered for its courage, but it was also a saga of supply, as men scoured the land for food, drank from rivers, and bargained with local peoples. Each step of their march home was marked not only by danger from enemies but by the endless search for sustenance. Sieges, too, were campaigns of logistics more than of battle. To surround a city for months or years required immense stores of food for the attackers. If supplies failed, the besiegers were forced to retreat, no matter how strong their walls or weapons. The defenders, meanwhile, relied on their own granaries, on wells within the walls, on the hope that relief would come before hunger overcame them. Many cities fell not to assault but to starvation, their people weakened until resistance was impossible. The story of sieges across the world is a story of stomachs as much as of swords. The lessons of these campaigns are clear. Victory belonged not always to the bravest but to the best supplied. Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Xerxes, all were judged not only by their battles but by their ability to feed and move their armies. When they succeeded, their names became legend. When they failed, their armies perished in silence, remembered only in fragments. The great campaigns of history remind us that war is not decided only in moments of clash but in the long days of marching, eating, drinking, and waiting, when the hidden army of logistics sustains or betrays the visible army of men. In the quiet moments of these campaigns, when soldiers sat by fires chewing bread, or when animals drank deeply from rivers, or when wagons creaked under their loads, the true heart of war was revealed. It was not the shout of battle but the murmur of sustenance, the steady rhythm of life maintained against the odds. Generals might win fame for bold maneuvers, but the nameless laborers, drivers, sailors, and farmers who fed them were the true victors of endurance. Part 15. Legacy and Lessons. When we look back across the long arc of the ancient world, at the armies that marched, the empires that rose and fell, and the cities that flourished or crumbled, a single truth shines through the haze of memory. No army ever fought alone. Behind every clash of spears, every roll of drums, every triumphant entry through the gates of a conquered city, there was the steady, patient work of logistics. Food carried in sacks, water drawn from wells, roads paved with stone, animals driven step by step, craftsmen hammering at anvils, engineers raising towers. These were the foundations upon which the stories of generals and kings were written. Without them, victories would have turned to ashes, and empires would have dissolved before their glory had even been sung. The legacy of ancient logistics is vast, for it not only shaped the wars of its time but also left lessons that echo into the present. The Egyptians, sustained by the Nile, showed that a river could be the heart of both life and war, carrying food to armies as surely as it carried silt to fields. The Mesopotamians, with their canals and storehouses, revealed the power of administration, of recording harvests and measuring rations, of making war not only with spears but with clay tablets and scribal ink. The Greeks taught the importance of naval supply, of fleets that shadowed armies and lifelines stretched across the sea. The Romans perfected the art of order, binding their empire with roads, camps, and granaries that turned their legions into machines of endurance. The Persians demonstrated the value of communication and speed, their royal road carrying supplies and messages across the breadth of empire. India, with its elephants, revealed both the burdens and the awe-inspired by animals of war. And China, with its canals, granaries, and disciplined administration, showed what it meant to feed armies counted not in tens of thousands but in hundreds of thousands. In every land, in every age, the same reality returned: armies march on their stomachs. A soldier without bread is a soldier who cannot fight. A horse without fodder is a cavalryman stranded. An army without water is an army already defeated. Generals who ignored these truths, who trusted too much in courage or fortune, saw their men wither before ever reaching the battlefield. Generals who remembered them, who planned for the daily needs of life as carefully as for the grand maneuvers of war, became the architects of victories that endured. The lessons of ancient logistics also remind us of the human cost hidden beneath the surface. For every soldier who lifted a spear, there were farmers whose grain fed him, laborers who built the roads beneath his feet, sailors who rowed the ships that carried his supplies, women and children who ground flour and baked bread in distant villages. The glory of generals was built upon the quiet toil of countless unnamed lives. War was not only fought in fields of battle, but in fields of barley and wheat, in forests stripped for timber, in workshops glowing with fire, in the steady flow of rivers and canals. To speak of logistics is to honor those whose work was silent but indispensable. Even today, the echoes remain. Modern armies may move with trucks, trains, and aircraft rather than wagons and oxen, but the principle is unchanged. Soldiers still require food, water, fuel, and shelter. Campaigns still rise or fall on the strength of supply lines. Victories are still shaped by the hidden army that carries bread and builds roads. The ancient world, in its ingenuity and endurance, laid down the patterns that endure to this day. Roads, ports, depots, stockpiles, communication networks. These are not inventions of the modern age, but refinements of lessons first learned when men marched with bronze spears and wooden shields. The closing reflection of ancient logistics is therefore a reminder of humility. We celebrate battles and kings, yet it is the quiet routines of sustenance that make such moments possible. The march of empire was the march of bread and water, the creak of carts, the bray of donkeys, the hiss of forges, the splash of oars. Without them, courage collapses, discipline withers, and armies dissolve into dust. Logistics is the hidden general, silent but commanding, shaping history without ever standing upon a battlefield. As the fires of ancient camps fade in our imagination, and the echoes of hammers upon anvils grow still, we can picture the soldiers of those long-gone ages settling at last into rest. Their stomachs filled with bread and wine, their animals watered and tethered, their weapons sharpened and mended, they lay upon the earth, beneath the stars, trusting in the quiet machinery of logistics that would sustain them tomorrow. Their generals planned battles, but their survival lay in these simple certainties: food, water, shelter, order. The armies of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, Persia, India, and China all shared this truth, though they were separated by oceans and deserts. It was the common language of war, spoken in the crackle of fires and the murmur of rations, in the creak of wagons and the splash of rivers. And so we close this journey through the hidden army of the ancient world, knowing that though their swords have rusted and their banners fallen, their logistics still endure in our own age, shaping how we march, how we fight, and how we endure. Thank you for walking through the long roads of history, through the rivers and canals, the forges and camps, the herds of animals and the granaries of kings. This has been a journey into the quiet heart of war, where bread and water mattered as much as bravery, and where logistics, unseen, uncelebrated, carried the armies of the ancient world upon its shoulders. As you drift into rest, may the steady rhythm of that hidden army remind you of the endurance that sustains all struggles, and may the silence of their labor bring you peace.